Today you'll hear a story that will change the way you see strength and respect. Things aren't as simple as they look. Watch until the end. Subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The town of Cedar Falls lay hidden among misty forests and long stretches of silent highway, a place that most people never noticed unless they were born there or had reason to disappear. Its rhythm was slow, the kind of rhythm where a passing truck on Main Street felt like an event. The residents lived steady lives, simple and predictable, shaped by the quiet weight of the surrounding woods. It was here, many years ago, that Steven Seagal had first stepped onto a mat under the watchful eye of his teacher, Mr. Raymond Ellis. Now he returned, not to train, but to grieve. Mr. Ellis had passed away, and the funeral brought together faces from the past, both familiar and distant. Steven sat among them in silence, listening as the pastor spoke, memories slipping into his mind without permission. He remembered Ellis's sharp eyes, the calm voice that carried both kindness and authority, the way the old master would stop a drill to correct posture with a single touch, and then say, "Respect yourself first. Then respect the art." Those words had carried Steven through decades of life, through storms both public and private. And yet, as the final prayer ended and the casket lowered into the ground, he felt something heavier than grief, a sense that Ellis's legacy was fragile, too easily forgotten. After the burial, while others lingered at the reception, Steven found himself walking alone down a street he hadn't seen in years. The familiar block appeared unchanged, the old bakery with its fading awning, the diner that still smelled of coffee and fried eggs, the rust-colored brick building that had once been the heartbeat of his youth, the Cedar Valley Martial Arts Academy. Its weathered sign still hung above the doorway, though the paint had peeled and the lettering looked tired. He stood there a long moment, remembering the nights when the sound of bare feet on mats echoed out the open windows, when laughter mingled with grunts of effort, when Ellis himself would bow at the start of every class as though the art were something greater than any man. But when Steven finally pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside, the air that met him was different. Gone was the steady hum of discipline. Instead, he found noise, harsh shouts, the slap of mats against bodies thrown carelessly. Young students lined up across the floor, not in neat rows of focus, but scattered, eyes darting with unease. The scent of sweat was mixed with tension, sharp and suffocating. At the center stood a man he did not know. Victor Kane. Tall, broad-shouldered, with slicked back hair, and a voice that cut like a whip. He barked commands, and his corrections came not with guidance, but with force. A hand clapped too hard on a shoulder, a shove disguised as demonstration. He smiled when students flinched. He frowned when they tried to move with care. To him, every exercise was about dominance, not refinement. Steven leaned quietly against the wall, unnoticed for a moment, and watched. He saw a boy, no older than 12, paired against a much larger partner. The boy took hit after hit, stumbling, barely keeping his balance, while Kane shouted encouragement not at him, but at the one striking. "Harder! Don't let up! Break him down!" The boy's eyes filled with tears, but no one stopped. No one dared. Steven's chest tightened. This was not the academy he remembered. This was not the spirit Ellis had guarded so fiercely. The very floor seemed stained with a different energy, as if the old roots of the place had been pulled up and replaced with something poisonous. When class ended, students scattered. Their steps hurried, relief etched in their faces. Kane noticed the stranger still standing at the wall. His eyes narrowed as he approached. "You here for sign-up?" Kane asked, his tone sharp, almost mocking. Steven shook his head slowly. "I trained here once, a long time ago, under Ellis." Kane smirked, brushing dust from his GI as though the name meant little. Ellis, he's gone. His school's gone with him. This is mine now." Stephen studied him carefully, his silence heavier than words. Finally, he said, "This isn't what Ellis built. He taught respect, control, art. What I saw out there, there's no art left." Kane laughed, a low, derisive sound. "Art? Respect? That's why the old man's style is dead. Times change. Out there, no one cares about bowing or breathing. They care about winning. And I deliver winners." Stephen's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "You deliver fear. That's not strength. That's weakness." Kane leaned closer, his grin wide. "I don't have time for old ghosts and soft speeches. We've got a tournament tonight. You'll see for yourself what real power looks like." With that, he turned his back and walked away, barking orders at a group of latecomers, as if the conversation had already ended. Stephen remained a moment longer, the echoes of the past clashing with the ugliness of the present. He closed his eyes briefly, hearing Ellis's voice in memory. "The art will survive if someone carries it." As Stephen stepped back into the cool evening, the sun sinking low over Cedar Falls, he knew what he had to do. The academy had lost its way, but he hadn't. Victor Kane's presence filled the academy like a storm that refused to pass. He was tall, broad, and carried himself with the authority of someone who thrived on control rather than respect. His voice cracked like a whip as he barked commands, and his corrections struck harder than the strikes of his students. Where Ellis once encouraged balance and grace, Kane demanded aggression and submission. He thrived on breaking spirits, so that those who remained were easier to mold. His methods left scars, not on the mats, but on the faces of the students who no longer smiled when they trained. A boy too small for his partner was shoved forward to spar until he collapsed, Kane shouting to his larger opponent to push harder, make him break. A teenage girl stood frozen as Kane adjusted her stance, with hands that lingered too long, the weight of humiliation heavier than the physical touch. Every lesson ended not with respect, but with fear, and fear had become the language of the academy. Stephen stayed longer this time, watching in silence. He saw the eyes of the students flicker when Kane passed too close, saw how they tightened their movements to avoid attention, how they obeyed not from discipline, but from survival. It was the opposite of Ellis's teaching, and the contrast clawed at him. He stepped forward as class ended, his voice calm but firm. "This is not what Ellis built. This is not his way." Kane looked him up and down with a smirk. "Ellis? That relic? He's gone, and with him his old-fashioned nonsense. This place is mine now. My students are tougher, meaner, stronger. I don't waste time on philosophy. Out there in the real world, nobody bows." Stephen shook his head. "You're not making them strong. You're teaching them to fear you. You mistake intimidation for power." The room had grown still. A few students lingered, pretending to pack their bags slower than usual, drawn to the quiet tension. Kane stepped closer, his grin wider, his voice dropping low. "I don't have time for ghosts. Tonight, we have a tournament. My students will show what real strength looks like. You can sit in the back and watch if you want a reminder of what happens when the old ways die." Stephen held his gaze without a word. Kane's smirk faltered for the briefest second, but he turned away quickly, snapping at a group of teenagers to tighten their belts and clean the mats. The spell was broken. Yet the echo of the confrontation lingered in the room long after Stephen left. As he stepped into the cool air outside, the weight of what he had seen pressed hard against him. Kane had twisted the academy into something Ellis would never have recognized. A house of fear instead of a school of discipline. The upcoming tournament was not about skill or honor. It was a stage for Kane's cruelty disguised as victory. Stephen walked down the quiet street of Cedar Falls, his steps steady, his mind turning. Ellis's voice seemed to follow him like an echo from years past. Respect yourself first. Then, respect the art. The memory of those words drew a line in the sand. Kane had made his claim, but Stephen knew the truth. And when the time came, the art would have its answer. The gymnasium of Cedar Falls filled slowly that evening, the bleachers creaking under the weight of curious townsfolk, parents and siblings who came to watch the local martial arts tournament. The smell of popcorn mixed awkwardly with the sharp tang of disinfectant that clung to the mats in the center of the floor. Lights buzzed overhead, too bright, creating shadows that stretched along the walls. At the front of it all, Victor Kane paced like a commander about to lead his army into battle. His students stood in formation, their GIs crisp, their expressions tight with both fear and anticipation. The first matches began, and it quickly became clear what Kane had taught them. His students struck hard, without hesitation, with no thought of restraint or control. A boy twice the size of his opponent pinned him against the mat and twisted his arm until the smaller child cried out in pain. Kane clapped loudly, praising the victor for his killer instinct. Parents shifted uncomfortably in the stands, some whispering to one another, others staring in disbelief. One by one, the Academy's fighters crushed their opponents, not with clean technique, but with sheer brutality. There was no grace in their movements, only force. Stephen sat quietly in the back, arms folded, his expression unreadable. He watched as the crowd grew restless, murmurs spreading each time another child limped off the mat. Victories piled up, but they left the air heavy with unease. The applause was thin, reluctant, the silence between bouts louder than any cheer. What Kane called success looked to everyone else like disgrace. A final match ended with a teenage girl struck so hard she fell and did not rise immediately. Gasps rippled across the bleachers, and her mother rushed forward before Kane waved her off with irritation. "She's fine," he barked, dismissing the concern. The girl stood shakily, her face pale, and the crowd's murmurs turned sharper, tinged with anger. It was then that Stephen rose. He walked down the aisle, each step steady, his presence drawing attention without effort. Conversations hushed as he reached the edge of the mat. His voice carried clearly, though he spoke without raising it. "This is not victory. This is humiliation. This is not what Ellis built." Kane froze for a moment, then forced a laugh that rang hollow against the silence of the room. "And who are you to judge, old man? These are champions. They win. That's all that matters." Stephen's gaze did not waver. Winning without honor is losing twice. You've turned this place into a stage for cruelty, not for art. If you believe your way is strength, then show it yourself. Step onto the mat. A hush fell. The students glanced at one another, then at their teacher. The parents leaned forward, curiosity sharp in their eyes. The tension in the air was heavy, a moment balanced on the edge of a blade. Kane sneered, his pride unwilling to let the challenge go unanswered. "Fine," he said, his voice sharp, his grin wide. "I'll show everyone just how outdated your so-called art really is. You want to fight? You've got one." Stephen nodded once, then stepped calmly onto the mat. He did not bow. He did not speak further. The silence that followed was electric, charged with expectation. For the first time that night, the crowd was united, waiting to see not just another fight, but the truth of what martial arts was meant to be. Victor Kane stepped onto the mat with a swagger meant to intimidate, his red belt tied tight, his grin sharp and taunting. He turned to the crowd and raised his hands, as though he had already won. Murmurs rippled through the bleachers, some uneasy, some curious, as all eyes shifted between the confident teacher and the man who stood across from him with calm stillness. Steven Seagal bowed once, his movements deliberate, not for Cain, but for the mat itself, for the art that had shaped his life. The match began with explosive aggression. Cain lunged forward, striking with wild hooks and stomping kicks, every movement fueled by power and anger. His steps shook the mat, his breath harsh in his throat. Steven barely moved. He pivoted, shifted, allowed the strikes to cut air and hit nothing. Cain roared and pressed harder, but his fists found only space, his kicks only silence. The crowd leaned forward, confusion stirring. They saw Steven's body flow with minimal effort, his control turning Cain's fury into futility. Sweat already clung to Cain's forehead as he spun with a back fist aimed at Steven's jaw. Steven shifted half a step, the strike missing entirely. Cain stumbled, caught himself, and lashed out again. A flurry of knees and elbows, but Steven absorbed nothing. His timing perfect, his movement smooth. He redirected a blow with a gentle touch, let Cain's weight pull him forward, and the audience gasped as the larger man nearly toppled. There was no violence in Steven's motions, only precision. Cain grew desperate, his pride unraveling under the eyes of his students. He growled, his attacks losing form, his chest heaving with frustration. He drove forward, teeth clenched, body wide open. Steven's response came like water-cutting stone. He stepped aside, guided Cain's arm with the smallest of gestures, and brought him down with a controlled throw that looked effortless. Cain hit the mat with a heavy thud, breath exploding from his chest. For a moment, silence reigned. Then Steven knelt, placing Cain in a lock so clean and decisive that escape was impossible. His voice was calm, quiet enough that only the front rows heard at first, but it spread through the stillness like a tide. This is what art is. Control, not cruelty. Power, not fear. I could hurt you now. I could end this in violence, but that would prove nothing. The strength of martial arts is knowing when not to destroy. He released the hold and stood. Cain lay gasping on the mat, his eyes wide, his face pale, the grin that once seemed unshakable gone entirely. The crowd erupted into whispers, then applause, not for the brutality they had seen earlier, but for the calm storm that had just unfolded before them. Children leaned forward with awe, parents nodded with relief, and students who once obeyed Cain out of fear now stared at Steven with respect in their eyes. Victor Cain rolled onto his knees, humiliated, unable to speak. Steven did not look down on him, did not gloat. He simply bowed once more, this time toward the audience, honoring them with the same quiet dignity. The demonstration was over, but it was clear to everyone that the true lesson had only just begun. The silence that followed was heavier than applause. Victor Cain stayed on the mat, shoulders hunched, his breath ragged, while the crowd stared at him not with admiration but with doubt, confusion, even pity. Students who once laughed at his cruel jokes now looked away, ashamed. Others looked directly at Steven, their faces alight with something they hadn't felt in that room for a long time: respect. Slowly, one by one, the young fighters began to step away from Cain. They had seen the truth in front of them, a truth too undeniable to ignore. What had felt like power only hours before now looked hollow, and the man they had once feared seemed small in defeat. Steven stood calm at the edge of the mat, arms at his sides, his breathing even, as though the match had cost him nothing. He had not sought victory, but he had reminded them all what true mastery looked like. Parents gathered their children close, whispering words of relief. One mother, who had almost pulled her daughter from the academy months before, looked at Steven with tears in her eyes. A group of teenagers whispered among themselves, and their words carried across the quiet gym. This isn't what Ellis wanted. This isn't what we want either. Kane pushed himself to his feet at last, red-faced and broken. His belt hung loose, no longer a badge of authority but a reminder of his arrogance. He tried to speak, but the words stumbled and died in his throat. For the first time he had no command, no insult, no laugh to throw at those around him. He turned towards Stephen, his voice cracked when it finally came. "I was wrong." Stephen's gaze was steady, his tone quiet. "You don't owe me. You owe them." He gestured toward the students, the parents, the crowd that had witnessed every moment. And so Kane did. He lowered his head and apologized. Not in grand speeches, but in halting words that carried more weight than any shout he had ever barked. He admitted his pride had poisoned the academy, admitted that he had mistaken fear for strength, admitted that he had dishonored the name of Ellis. The students listened, some with folded arms, others with cautious eyes. But they heard the words. Redemption, if it could come, would not be easy. But for the first time it seemed possible. The academy did not close its doors that night. Instead, something inside it shifted. The next day, Kane returned quietly, not in his immaculate GI with its crimson belt, but in a plain black shirt and simple pants. He opened the doors early and cleaned the mats himself. No orders, no shouting, just silent work. Students arrived wary, unsure of what to expect, but they found a man humbled, stripped of his arrogance. Stephen did not remain to take Ellis's place. He never intended to become the new master of Cedar Valley Martial Arts Academy. He refused interviews, turned away reporters who had already begun to spread the story online, ignored the noise of fame that chased him wherever he went. Instead, he walked the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, ate at the diner, and visited the youth center, offering guidance without claiming authority. His presence was enough. His silence was a lesson all its own. In the weeks that followed, the academy began to breathe again. The laughter of children returned to its halls, the sharp edges of fear replaced by the rhythm of discipline and the curiosity of learning. A small student council formed, led by a few brave voices, including the very ones who had once shrunk under Kane's commands. They helped guide the future of the school, ensuring no one voice would ever dominate it again. Stephen returned only for a seminar once a month. He did not teach kicks or punches. He spoke of character, of resilience, of the strength it takes to stand firm in silence. Martial arts is not about defeating others, he told them, his voice calm. It's about refusing to be defeated by what's wrong. No one interrupted. No one looked away. They listened, because they understood now that this was the lesson Ellis had left behind. When the night finally came for Stephen to leave Cedar Falls, he did so without announcement. He walked past the academy one last time, its windows glowing warmly, the sound of students training carrying faintly through the air. He paused, looked through the glass, and saw not fear, not cruelty, but respect. He allowed himself a small smile, then continued down the quiet street. His boots tapped lightly against the sidewalk, his hands rested in his pockets, and his head was held high. He had won many things in life, trophies, belts, applause, but none of them compared to this. This was not about victory. This was about making sure others didn't have to lose. And in that truth lay the greatest legacy of all. What you've just seen is only the beginning. True stories can change more than you think. If you enjoyed this, subscribe, leave a like, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. There are many more powerful stories ahead.